and welcome to the Healthy Work and Workplaces podcast, hosted by the Healthy Work Research Unit at Aston University. Today's guest is Karen Maher, a chartered psychologist and lecturer at Aston Business School. We are delighted to have her with us today, and we're excited to hear about the recent work she's been engaged with. Karen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me.
So it's great to have you here to talk today about some of the things you've been doing recently. But before we do that, it's always nice with our guests just to kind of get a little bit of background of kind of how did they end up here. So can you briefly touch on the areas that you're interested in, where that interest came from, and kind of how you ended up here at Aston today?
Yeah, sure. So the stuff I'm interested in is really about the link between health and work, because good work is good for us. It's good for our health. So my work really is designed around how we make work as good for us as we possibly can. And I've taken a bit of a wiggly route to get to where I am now. And it's been a journey full of setbacks as well as some serendipitous meetings. So I was pretty average academically at school. I wasn't failing, but I wasn't setting the world alight either. And so I kind of fell into health through my sport. I swam competitively, was in a few different sports teams, came from a sporty family, and I had this ambition to become a physiotherapist. However, I didn't do very well in my A-levels. I didn't get a place on a physio degree, so I opted to do sport and exercise science instead, with the hope of sidestepping onto a physio degree later on. I just needed to get a 2-1. However, I enjoyed university a little bit too much, and ended up with a 2-2, and that kind of ended my journey to becoming a physio. So I fell into the fitness industry, first as a personal trainer, and then I ended up specialising, working with people with long-term health conditions, things like cardiac rehab, diabetes, and using exercise to manage their conditions. And over that time, I realised that most people knew what they needed to do, so either eat healthier or move more. And most of the challenges seemed to be psychological or social that were the barriers to them achieving what they wanted to do. So then when I was about 8.5 months pregnant with my youngest child, I got made redundant, and I ended up with a pot of redundancy money and no idea what to do with my life. And the organisation that I was working for at the time was right next to a university. So I walked out of my redundancy meeting and there was a banner up advertising an open day for postgraduate courses. So I thought, oh, why not? I've got nothing else to do. I walked in and ended up having the most amazing conversation with a psychology lecturer who quite literally has changed the course of my life. He had such a passion for psychology, and he ignited a real curiosity in me about why people behave the way that they do when it comes to health, even though his discipline was in cognitive psychology, so completely different to mine. But by the end of that conversation, I'd signed up for a psychology conversion course, and I started my training to be a chartered psychologist when my daughter was about 4 months old. I wouldn't recommend that. It was hard work. And then from there, I did a specialist master's in health psychology. And during my studies, I also took on some part-time work. I ended up working for the occupational health department for a fire and rescue service. I was their health and fitness advisor. So I was responsible for all the mandatory fitness testing of firefighters and their health screening, as well as other sort of health-related activities for their wider staff. I also picked up things like their occupational health training around stress management and hearing conservation, nutrition, that kind of thing. And at that time, the fire service were looking at changing some of their shift patterns, the way their firefighters were working, and some of their kind of arrangements at their fire stations, moving towards a more live-in shift arrangement. So they'd be on call for 24-hour shifts, up to 5 days at a time. And with my occupational health hat on, I thought there's got to be an impact on that for their health and their well-being, and possibly even their performance as well. And through my master's, I was aware that there was some research going on firefighter health by academics at Loughborough University. So I made contact with them to see if they'd be interested to look at it from a research perspective, which as academics, of course they were. There's someone coming to them with a research project, so they were really keen. And they managed to get funding for a PhD student to do that work. So I started the project as a stakeholder, And then when they got the funding for a PhD student, I was like, oh, I'm just coming to the end of my master's. Would I be able to apply? And I managed to get the place, but I had to leave my job because of a conflict of interest. So I ended up taking a fully funded PhD scholarship at Loughborough and left my job in the fire service. So I completed my PhD back in 2018 and then went on to an academic post at Coventry University in the psychology department, but it was mainly teaching focused. So I struggled to do much research during that time, and then landed my job here at Aston in January 22. And I've got a 50-50 teaching research role. So I'm much more able to do the research that I do now. And my research is very much influenced by my career journey. So it's all about making a difference to employees, particularly critical workers, frontline workers, to make the best of their health and make sure that work is good for them and doesn't have long-term health effects, so they can perform well and then also retire happy and healthy as well. And it's very much interdisciplinary. So because of my kind of practical element of the fitness, but also my psychology, I kind of bring those both together in my work. There was a very long-winded story, but you've got a potted history of my life now.
Sure, it was great. Thank you. Yes, so the shift towards interdisciplinary thinking and the focus on applied work is certainly something that has taken off, I would say, across academia now, which is that we can't just be doing research for the sake of research. It has to change the world or give us a practical recommendation for how we could do things better. And so would you be willing to tell us about one of the recent projects that you've got on which kind of continues that trend?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, nothing happens in a bubble. Organizations are complex systems. So it is more than just the psychology. It's the interconnection of everything. So the current project that I'm working on is with colleagues at Coventry University. So I'm working with Dr. Doug Thake, and he's an environmental physiologist. So he's really interested in the impact of the environment on the body. And he invited me onto a previous project as a qualitative methods expert when we were looking at personal protective equipment in policing in the UK. And after that project, he invited me into a conversation he was having with the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, or UK-BIC for short, to understand the impact of the working conditions of their workers. So UK-BIC is a government-funded facility for the development and production of recyclable batteries. So it's a non-commercial facility, and it's set up really to support commercial companies in scaling up their battery production for mass production. So it kind of fits in with the sustainability agenda and the low carbon energy agenda. And from that kind of perspective, high-tech gigafactories for lithium-ion batteries is a massive growth industry. The government's pledged up to sort of £500 million investment into this industry. And they're reckoning there could be somewhere up to 6 plants providing up to sort of 6,000 jobs in this particular industry. So it has the impact of a huge number of people. But the lithium-ion battery production requires a certain environment for those batteries to be produced. And it's what's called an ultra-low humidity environment. And that's where the batteries have to be produced in a relative humidity of less than 1%. So to give a kind of idea of what we're sitting in now, the ambient environment in the UK is about 40 to 50%. So it's really, really low, below 1%. And we know that low levels of relative humidity, so below 30%, has a detrimental effect on employee health through studies conducted on people like cabin crew, for example, where you've got that recycled air. And there's a phenomenon called sick building syndrome, which is linked to low humidity. And those sort of typical symptoms are things like upper airway irritation, dry skin, dry eyes, but also things around fatigue and brain fog, and dehydration, or kind of linked to the dehydration. But most of the studies that have been done in sort of that low humidity environment, they're dry, but they're not necessarily clean. And battery production needs a really sterile environment. So there's fewer particles in the atmosphere. So we don't know if the symptoms that the workers will experience will be the same as what it would be for cabin crew, for example, or whether there's more unique things that come around because of this clean atmosphere. So we were approached by the health and safety lead at UK BIC because he found that he just didn't have any guidance about how to advise the workers there. And he wanted to know whether it was something he needed to be worried about. So the aim of the project was really to explore the workers' experience of working in that clean and dry environment, just to see whether they do report similar or different, unique symptoms from working in that really low, humid environment.
And so it sounds like it's, if I've got this right, it's a series of interviews with these folks.
Yes, so we conducted interviews with every single member of staff in the facility that went into the clean and dry room, just to get their experience. But it was also in tandem with Doug collecting some physiological measures as well. So whilst the main part of my element of the project is looking at the kind of experience side of things and perceptions, Doug was also trying to triangulate that with some more kind of objective physiological data. So the facility isn't very big, so it was about 19 people. And some of those people were responsible for projects within the clean and dry room for their entire work shift. Others would pop in and out through the day. So there would be different levels of exposure to that environment across the different participants, which is why triangulating with the physiological measures that Doug was doing was really useful, because it meant that we'd be able to tease out some of the nuances across the participants. But there were 18 males and 1 female. So that does limit what we can say for females working in that environment. And also the majority of their work shifts were daytime, whereas if you look in manufacturing, they tend to work shift patterns. So again, there is some sort of limit in terms of what we can suggest around the impact, because the working patterns are slightly different for those employees. So it was interviews, but it kind of was with those physiological markers as well. And it was really just to get a good understanding of what the participants felt their experience was when they were working in that environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, alluding to that interdisciplinary nature of the project.
Mm.
So you show up and start asking questions about symptoms and things like this. Were the participants kind of aware that the environment that they were working in could be detrimental to their health? Did they have any consciousness of the potential threat of the environment that they were employed in?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there was a lot of talk around we just don't know. So there's no guidance. It's so new. We don't know if we need to be worried. There were some mentions of, this could be the next asbestos. So there was kind of the perception that there could be something as a risk. However, the same participants would also say in the next breath, but there's no data and we're engineers, and if there's no data, I'm not going to worry about it. So there was a certain degree of salience in how they engaged with the environment. And I think as well, the actual environment that they're working in, it is sterile. So it looks very clean. The white walls, there's no, it is just really, really clean and sterile. And that gives the perception of health, because if you think other sterile environments, that's like your hospitals, your operating theatres and things like that, where health happens. So I think there is a degree of salience around the risk. And there was one participant that talked about it's only when there was a door between 2 different clean and dry rooms, and the door kind of bows from the air pressure. And he goes, it's not until the door bows that I realise actually we're in a different environment. So it's almost like there's those triggers, those cues to actions that increase the salience to make people think, oh, actually, I am somewhere different. I am in a different environment. But yes, I think the perception of risk was really around how they engaged with that environment and the perceptions that they had of it.
Karen, I'm not sure at what point you are with this project at the minute, but are there any kind of initial results that have tumbled out and possible recommendations that the company might adopt to keep their workers healthier?
Yeah, so we've got some early findings. The analysis is still being refined. And so one thing that I didn't mention, so the health and safety officer or manager, he gave some general guidance about working in that room that he felt were sensible, common sense for working in a really humid environment. So his guidance was around staying in the room for no more than 2 hours, so taking a break every 2 hours and then coming out to have a drink, because there's no water allowed within those rooms. So the water cooler, they have to go out into another room. They're also fully in PPE. So that means that in order to come out and have a break, they need to come out of their PPE before going back in again. So the guidance from the occupational health and safety manager was to have a drink every 2 hours and to have a break out of the room every 2 hours. And what we found from our initial findings was there was nuances to how well people followed that guidance. So, and it tended to be around work demands. So if there were certain demands that were required of them that meant that they stayed in longer than that 2 hours, then people would be happy to do so. For example, if there was a customer that they needed to fulfill an order for, and they needed that work to be done, then they would stay in there longer. So there was certain elements of the job that kind of prevented was perhaps the wrong word, because there was no pressure from management. It was like an internal pressure that I want to do a good job. I want to get my job done well. So I'm going to stay in this room longer, even though I've had my 2 hours. So there were certain demands that were being placed upon them as to how they then engaged with that work environment. There was also different demands that impacted on their recovery as well. So for example, family demands. So it meant that they were fatigued from work, but due to their family situations, they weren't necessarily able to rest and recover in the way that they would perhaps want to. Things like their leisure activities as well. So if someone was playing a lot of sport, they were then not able to load their hydration in high enough to be able to recover. So there were additional demands that were being placed upon them that impacted on their rest and recovery. In terms of recommendations, it's still early days because we need to triangulate some of the physiological measures with it. But certainly I think there's some interesting stuff around the salience and encouraging the protective behaviours. So the things like the drinking water and the taking the breaks and things that we can do to increase people's likelihood of engaging in those behaviours, because there's certain psychological theories that we can apply to this, such as the health belief model, and that's how people almost have a cost-benefit analysis and also have a perception of risk, so how severe the risk is and how likely it is that that risk affects them. And so there's certain things that we can do potentially to manipulate that kind of perception of risk and also the perception of the benefits of engaging in the protective behaviour, that people will be more likely to drink water and more likely to take the breaks, etc. And yeah, we're not quite sure what that looks like yet. I think there's still a need to kind of look at the environment and look at things that we can do to make that salience, make things more salient. But I think that's the next step, is to look at ways in which we can intervene to engage those behaviours.
Absolutely. So one of the things as you were speaking there was I was reminded of different interventions from the world of behavioural science and social psychology to try and make people more salient about what the behaviours they should be engaging in are, or what the risks to not engaging in a behaviour would be. So that can be something as simple as just putting up signage in next to the water cooler. It could be moving the water cooler to a more easy to access location, all of these different things. So I think that one of the merits of this program of research that you've got is it seems to be very proactive in that you've identified that this is going to be an area of huge investment and many more people working in this space. So it's important that early days we understand what the threats are and how they can be mitigated. So I think that that's a real strength of this kind of research. And just to go back again, it reflects that attraction you have to applied work that actually make a difference in the world. So moving on then, I've got just a couple of questions, which is to say, what is next for you? What's coming down? What's on the horizon for you?
I think the next step for me is really to push this project a little bit further, to let's look at ways in which we can design interventions to make that environment as healthy as it can be. But also, we only had one female participant, so there's very little that we can infer that there is a sex-based difference in the experience of working in this environment. So I think the next step would be also to look at the difference in physiologies, to see if there is unique responses, particularly seen as there may be difference in responses over the course of a menstrual cycle, also at peri and post-menopause, etc. Because if we've got potential of 6,000 employees at these new gigafactories, a large proportion of those are going to have female physiology. So we need to think about differences in the way so that the guidance that we give is effective for all, not just for the male physiology. But I've also got some other projects that I'm really interested in as well. So looking at maladaptive coping with work demands. So primarily looking at things like substance use and how people use substances to cope with the demands of work, and looking at things we can do at an organisational level to reduce the risk of employees engaging in those maladaptive behaviours or feel able to seek help when they need it. So that's kind of the two different prongs of my research going forward from here.
Excellent. So the final question then is, do you have any advice for students who would kind of want to get into a similar area as yourself? It's very exciting. Like I said, it's real world impact based stuff. If you could give a piece of advice to our younger listeners, what would you say to them?
Yeah, certainly. So if you are interested in health and safety within the workplace or occupational health, I'd explore the work that's going on by the Health and Safety Executive or the Society of Occupational Medicine. They've got some fantastic resources on their websites, as well as looking at sort of case studies of what organisations have done in terms of protecting their employees' health. Also, occupational health and safety is applicable across a whole range of sectors. Well, every sector, really. We all engage in a certain level of risk every time we come to work. So there's an opportunity to make a real tangible difference to the health and well-being of workers. Some sectors have greater risks than others, so it's really worth getting to know the sector that you want to work in to understand the different risks that are involved, but also how different job roles interact with those risks in order to be able to manage them. So you have to know your workers and the jobs that they do in order to be able to help them have the best and best experience within their work and to protect their health and ensure they reach retirement age happy and healthy.
Excellent. Karen Maher, Chartered Psychologist and Lecturer at Aston Business School. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Simon.